Hello, sword friends. Here we are to talk about another beautiful sword that's very kindly on loan to me. This was sent to me by sword friend Frank. Thank you so much, Frank, for making sure that this came to me before going off to you. This is a sword that I have had the chance to look at in the past, but it was a long time ago. This is a sword from LK Chen. It is the Clarence Mackey Double Dragon Sui Dao. So I have seen this sword before. I've handled one of these in the past, and I'm very glad that I didn't review it at the time because now LK Chen has done one of the things that he is characteristic of, and he has improved on the model. So this is probably version number 4 or 5. Compared to many sword makers, LK Chen has a reputation for continuously revisiting existing models. He doesn't seem to ever be satisfied with how the sword is produced, and he continually goes and refines and improves upon the product, following whatever idea he has in his head, usually trying to get it as faithful as possible to the antiques that he either owns or is studying. In this case, this is based on a specific sword that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It has a very characteristic ring pommel design that has these two dragons that are chasing this flame right here. And the sword is unfortunately very deteriorated. We have the elements, we have the scabbard fittings, and we have bits of the hilt, but almost all of the organic components have fallen apart. And while the brass and the bronze portions have survived, since copper elements survive very well. Unfortunately, the blade we cannot really see on the inside. So the type of blade inside of it is a bit of a mystery. Now, this is dated probably to around the turn of the Tang. The Sui dynasty was a kind of short-lived dynasty right after the split of the northern and southern dynasty periods. So it only lasts for less than a century, and the Tang takes many things from the Sui dynasty, including, for instance, how these ornate ring uh, designs on the Dao are used to denote what type of guards are there. So depending on what status you are, you might be able to put a dragon or a giraffe or a unicorn or what have you onto your Dao, and that'll show what rank you are in the military, what type of guard you are. Um, and so as a result of that, it's a little difficult to date the specific sword that's in the Metropolitan Museum. I've talked with the Scholar General about it, and the type of kind of cloud motif that we have here on the quillons, there are researchers in China that suggest that this may actually be a Tang period sword instead of a Sui Dao. But these are both right from around that area, that right around that time frame. Before we take a look at the blade, let's just take a quick overview of the entire sword. So the entire sword is really gorgeous. So it's highly polished, this dark wood scabbard. It's got these bright, shiny brass elements that are the fittings on it, as is characteristic of this period where we have these Dao that are no longer using a scabbard slide that is held high in the belt, kind of like in a Japanese style. This instead has these Central Asian type of suspension methods. So this is called a P style scabbard suspension. And again, we see it in Sasanian style swords. So if we look to Iran, you'll see that they have these 2-point suspensions on their long swords, and it's likely that that's where this type of suspension originated and was transmitted across Central Asia to China, where it's developed into these horizontally kept Dao, which makes it a little bit easier when you're using them in on horseback. The little elements that you have here on the scabbard, or rather on the hilt, are all very nicely executed. The brass on the cross is very well done and very comfortable, so that even if you slide your hand all the way up and choke up on the grip, it's got a very nice, it's a very nice feeling having your hand in a kind of Dao Fa position where you hold it very close to the guard. The most impressive thing to me compared to the sword that I had studied previously is the fidelity of the casting that's done here in the ring pommel. All of the elements and all of the details really stand out. There's no muddiness. There's nothing that I can't see a seam. I don't. It's all just stands out very, very nicely. It's all well polished. It's very well executed, especially compared to the one that I had seen before. So LK Chen has really refined how he's executing these guards. My understanding is that he, kind of like the originals, these are inserted. So the steel blade goes into a steel tang, and then there's this brass pommel that has just a little kind of tab that goes down, and then the pommel and the tang go side by side, and there's oftentimes a little peg that fastens them together. I don't think it goes deep, even as deep as this rivet. It may. So this rivet here connects to a little lanyard. On the original one I had, I believe it pivoted. This one doesn't. That may be consistent with both types, both free pivoting uh, lanyard attachments and fixed lanyard attachments may be consistent with the style of rivets we see on swords of this period. Now, there's a question as to the length of this guard. I believe he makes two versions. I believe he makes one with a kind of extended grip and one that's kind of shorter. And people were finding there were issues where you'd be holding it, and this rivet would be right in the middle of your hand. This is long enough that even with my big hands, I don't end up bumping into it. If so, I believe that this is the extended grip version. Um, I'd be interested to see how the original kind of shorter version, which I suspect is closer to the measurements of the one in the museum, would fit. But I could see how many people would probably really not appreciate that, because it would require a lot of experimentation in order to figure out how do you hold a sword that has this big, heavy, clunky kind of keychain stuck right in the middle of where you're trying to grab it. So on release, it has a tunko or collar, which is very similar to the style of habaki that you see on Japan. Now, it's conjectured that these would actually be used to protect the finger if you put a finger over the guard. And I mentioned before that the guard is very comfortable for you to rest your hand right up to the end. So if I dispense with the scabbard for a second, this has a pretty long blade on it. Do I have my tape measure? Here. So we'll measure this out. This is a 70, this is almost an 80-inch blade. So for a single-handed sword, this is pretty long. It's again got a long enough grip that it can be used either one or two-handed, but the proportions of it, the fact that it has as much distal taper as it does, starting off at about 5.5, 6 millimeters, and then tapering down to about 2.5 millimeters or so, means that this is very maneuverable in the hands, so that if you want to practice your swordsmanship, this is very comfortable and very easy to work with, even in just a single hand. It has what would be called Kuriha Zakuri cross section in Japanese. So rather than having a high ridge like we would see on a normal katana, the bevel, the primary bevel, goes very far down before it starts the secondary bevel. So this was a type of technique that we see in a lot of Han Dynasty swords. Japanese swords originally were like this. So in many ways, this is actually the style of sword that is kind of the predecessor of the saber. So before sabers became curved, this type of sword is what you saw across Central Asia. You had flat backs with a couple different type of tips. You could have a spear point tip, you could have raised yelmon, you could have a harsh chisel tip. In this case, since again, remember, we don't know what the original tip was inside the deteriorated scabbard, they have a kind of rounded tip. And these type of tips are known as far back as the Han Dynasty. Um, and then, as mentioned again, the cross section is basically a flattened section with minimal taper, followed by a secondary bevel. Again, in Japanese, it would be called kureha zukuri, cross section. This allows it to be very robust, so it's not necessarily as sharp as some of the other cross sections where the bevel goes further up the blade, but it does allow it to hit harder targets, helmets, other blades, other targets where you are concerned about damaging the blade. It gives it more meat behind it, and still be able to deliver kind of fierce cuts. So if you're concerned about things like putting niku on the blade, so if one way to reinforce the edge is to do rounding, but that's a difficult thing to do, and you talk about getting too much clamshelling going on, and then you end up with the blade not being sharp. So one solution to that is you just bring the edge bevel closer to the apex, and that's the solution that we see here. And so this is kind of where the idea started, and eventually we end up with the bevel going much higher in the blade. So this is a Yuan period saber. So before we end up with curvature, we have lower bevels, and then as the centuries go on, we end up with the blades curving and the bevel goes higher, and this is more like you see on Central Asian sabers. Eventually you see it on Japanese sabers, and eventually after the Mongol period, you see it on Chinese sabers as well. So how does this sword handle? Let's take a look outside. So unsurprisingly, the sword comes razor sharp. LK Chen, of course, knows how to put a wonderful edge on it. And because it is so long, because it has, an 80 plus centimeter blade on it, it lets you create some wonderful leverage and just sail through light targets in particular. But because of the amount of meat it has on it, this would hit very hard. You'd be able to hit some very reinforced targets without too much concern over damaging the sword. So this is a really good intersection for both being able to cut light targets, to be able to be strong enough to go after heavier targets, and yet it's not so cumbersome that I feel like I'm going to be able to that I'm going to be at a disadvantage if I end up getting in a fight, even though this almost certainly would be used with a shield, so that I'd be able to do most of my wardings with the shield and then be able to strike with the other sword, or use it two-handed if I lose my shield for whatever reason. This is again a beautiful example from LK Chen. I think that this most recent iteration is well worth the asking price. Thank you again, Francis, for letting me have the opportunity to study the Double Dragon Sui Dao, a really pretty sword from a very interesting place in Chinese history at the kind of dawn of the Age of the Saber. And again, this is what came first. Okay, guys, until next time, take care.